a pretty cinematic suspense for us. You
yes.
provided. We wait for as usual for like next 5 minutes.
Of course.
If you agree to have the larger crowd around, and then we start.
Okay, I'll turn off my microphone now because I think it relieves your system, doesn't it, Pavel?
Yes.
Does it relieve your system if I turn off my microphone?
No. Everything will be okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Hello, Donald. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, Donald has so nice books behind him. One would be so curious to know what they are.
I have probably the biggest collection of books on Giambattista Vico in my neighborhood.
Really? In your neighborhood, in your more confined neighborhood or the larger neighborhood?
Yes, I know for sure on my street I have the most.
Okay.
Is that because you consider yourself of the age of gods, the age of heroes, or the age of men?
I'm in the age of fools. I'm glad you're letting me take a vacation from my age. I'll enjoy this session.
Right.
I know a painter called Miguel Kunze. He must be a relative. Am I right?
Oh, it's a very common name in Deutschland because it's a diminutive of Conrad.
I see.
Well, we say Hinz und Kunz.
Yep,
Hinz
yep.
und Kunz is everybody.
Frau Hinz und Frau Kunz they're always talking in the courtyard or something like that. So there's all these jokes.
Yeah.
Very funny.
Oh, my tea has arrived.
I have a question, Drew, with introduction, which I'm sort of obligatory supposed to provide. Would you like me to read those points that you have provided for the lecture, or would you like to do it yourself?
I think they should become apparent as I go on with the lecture anyway.
Right.
So it's probably not necessary.
Okay, so shall I just skip it and concentrate more on the introduction of you as a persona?
But, when it comes to an introduction of myself, I usually try never to omit the word charlatan.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I once did this in a lecture I was giving at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, and the ranking member of the panel I was participating in, who was a partner of Frank Gehry and had been a professor at Harvard, he seemed very taken aback when I mentioned this, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm a charlatan too."
Very revealing.
Yes.
Perhaps I should say I grew up in New York City at a time when many competing artistic movements became part of the daily conversation of people's lives, even if they were not specialists in art. So in the 70s, when we had the pop minimalism and conceptual art simultaneously competing, and everyone was conscious of being in the aftermath of the art of the post-war, which was especially relevant to painting, and which was, I suppose, if you're a disciple of Rosenberg, you say action painting, and if you're a disciple of Greenberg, you say abstract expressionism. And some of these, and there were around town many people who knew these figures still and who remembered them personally. And so one got a sense of their interests and their personalities. And then gradually the 80s came, when I was already graduated from university, and all these movements were sort of eclipsed suddenly by something quite different, which made everyone wish to forget the developments of the 70s, and especially the developments of the post-war. So it became normal for us to try to, as an amateur activity, read the art that we were seeing around us. And then later I had a slightly more formal training in this. But it just became part of our daily lives.
Mm.
But perhaps I should say that in light of this experience, this project of mine related to what I call metonymic narrative arose from two questions that I posed to myself. One was very important to me. It is, well, it was very clear to me that in the previous decades, there were artistic movements that affected everyone in some way, especially the artists, and which gradually were transmitted around the world, and which were, in some sense, very linked to their time. So I asked, what is the artistic movement of our time? And as we live in a sort of postmodern condition, which is very international in its influences and very encyclopedic in its scope, I thought to answer this question would be inherently more difficult given our circumstances. The other question, of course, was if I would identify such a movement, in what way was it related to our time? In what way was it, in a sense, a sort of aesthetic spokesman for our time, in a way that we could imagine that was a very clear and obvious to answer in the case of abstract expressionism in the 40s and 50s, or in Europe, informel or art autre. And similarly for pop in the 60s. There we see very much the relationship to mechanical reproduction, to the spread of popular and mass communication that culminated with the invention of the internet, and yet was still rooted in previous movements, especially the Ashcan school of American painting. And in advertising, and therefore capitalism. And so I asked myself as well, with respect to this movement of we're here to discuss today, in what sense is it also related to our time? These were the two questions. And the way I came up with the answer to the first question, which is what is the movement that is characteristic of our time, and what do its various components have in common? I discovered the first thing is that no matter where I would go in the world, whether it was to Asia or Latin America or to Europe or New York or California, I would notice that there was a tremendous move away from formal legibility. In other words, most of the art that I was seeing was art that you could never tell what it was by looking at it, even if you were a specialist. And this became, in my view, radically the case. And I think many of you perhaps have seen the list of artists that I provided. And this is true of all of their works. You practically could be Gadamer and you could look at it and have no idea what you're looking at. And this I began to see as not only intentional, but intrinsic to the sort of, I hate to use the term rules, but to the practice of this movement, that it does not have formal discernibility. And so one of the clues that I use to recognize a work of this school, if you'll allow me to call it this, is if it seems to have no overt formal discernibility, then I begin to suspect.
Right.
And I think that the three illustrations that I provided are evidence of this. In one of them, which is a work by Jill Magid, American artist, what you see is in a jewelry box, it's just a diamond ring. And ordinarily, no matter how specialized you are in contemporary art, you practically not only would not be able to tell what it means, you might not even be able to identify it even as an art object. Or an art.
Drew, it looks like you already started the talk, which is fantastic. I would not like to interrupt, but I think just to pay a little depth to the formal structure of our talks, if you allow me, the interruption, I would like to say a few words first, because I think this is just about the right time, and then all the rest is yours.
Please.
I think this is the best moment for me to provide a little introduction to our lecture, which is the fourth lecture from the series of the sealed studio talks, which was initiated by our Department of Painting and Drawing at the University of Arts in Poznan, with the support of the Dean of Painting, Dr. Tomasz Kalitko. And we're tremendously happy to have you here, Drew. The series of lectures, just to sort of recall the basic idea, is dedicated to the encounter with the critical thought of the most renowned contemporary theoreticians, art critics, curators, and artists. And at the same time, at the pandemic solitary confinement, we believe that with our effort, the forced physical distance can be reshaped into the advantage of the greater proximity in exchange of ideas. So this is the sentence which I'm stubborn enough to say at the beginning of every lecture. And going to the major figure we have the honor to host here, I would just like to say a few words about Drew Hammond before he starts his talk with the title Metonymic Narrative in Contemporary Art. The pleasure of hosting you, Drew, is also for me a kind of a lesson not to underestimate anybody who accidentally you meet at the Kleine Bier Markthalle in Berlin, because this is the origin of our meeting. So I would suggest anybody who would ever have a chance to sit in any table in Berlin, when hopefully the pandemic situation will allow us to smile at each other, even to a stranger, to look at the stranger with the more care and suspicion, because that was the moment when we met at this place very close to my former studio, when I sat in the same table. There are no other tables available, with two gentlemen, and one of them was showing the catalog to the other one, who actually seemed like, from the talk that I heard, wrote the introductory text for this catalog. And this was Drew who actually showed me this catalog, exchanging the glances between strangers, asking me, well, what do I think about the text and art? And I said that it depends on what's inside. And then we started to discuss. And then it turned out that basically the person I accidentally met was Drew Hammond, whom I'll be delighted to search for and look for your participation in this talk anyway. But that old accident eased up the situation, and then allow me to stay in touch with Drew for, I think, the last 6 or 7 years so far. So let me say a few words about the gentleman we have a chance to host, and the gentleman I had the chance to take a seat in the kleine Markthalle in Oranienplatz. So this gentleman was born in London in 1957. Hammond studied philosophy of aesthetics under Jose Maria Sanchez de Muñan at the University of Madrid, and then Chinese aesthetics and Neo-Confucian thought under Wing Tsit Chan of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the Columbia University, where he entered the PhD program in between 97 and 76 and 82. During the 80s and 90s, as a successive resident of 5 countries in Latin America, he wrote art criticisms for El Diario de Caracas and other publications under the pseudonym M.T. Han. Correct me if I'm wrong. In 2006, he was appointed a visiting lecturer in contemporary art for the Global Architecture, History and Theory program of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Landscape Architecture and Design. And in the following year, he directed a graduate seminar in Beijing in the theory of perspective in the classical Chinese art for the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Also in 2007, he was appointed to lecture in the Chinese language on contemporary Western art between 1962 and 2005 at the Graduate Faculty of the China Art Academy in Beijing, and continues to lecture annually on the contemporary art for the Executive Master Program in Art Market Studies of the University of Zurich. As former senior international correspondent for The Art Economist, Hammond specialized in presentation strategy in contemporary art. Now a resident in Berlin, he serves as a curatorial consultant on Heldart, a non-profit art organization that makes site-specific contemporary art exhibitions. Most recently, he has lectured at the Deutsche Bank Kunsthalle in Berlin on Seeing as Process. Veronika Kellendorfer and Steve Rowell, a cooperation with the Senate Chancellery Berlin as a part of the City Partnership Berlin and Los Angeles. He has also lectured for the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin, the Chinese Academy of Art in Beijing, and for the University of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Besides having published numerous exhibition catalogs and essays in books on artists' works, and he also has published in Text zur Kunst, Flash Art, Art Investor, the Art Newspaper in China, and other periodicals dedicated to art topics. Concomitantly with his art activities, Hammond has also published essays on Kubrick and Tarkovsky. He worked in a variety of capacities in the film industry, serving as script and editorial consultant to several motion picture productions companies, including Donald Cammell, Perpetual Motion Pictures, and LTD and PA Films, Cineville and LCC Los Angeles, and Neofilm in Cologne. He has written or modified unproduced or uncredited screenplays with several directors, including Donald Cammell, Mark Forrester, Martin Donovan, Giuseppe Tornatore, and others. So this is a short introduction. Just to conclude, never underestimate somebody you have a chance to meet over the table in places like Kleine Markthalle. Please stay cautious about all your surroundings. Ladies and gentlemen, Drew Hammond, Metonymic Narrative in Contemporary Art. We all yours.
Thank you, Dominic, for this kind introduction. It's an honor to be part of this series and in such illustrious company. And I must say that our meeting was not so unusual for me, because I used to know the late Spanish poet Tomás Segovia, and I met him when he was a professor at Princeton, and I remarked that it was a puzzle how close we had become in such a short time. And he said to me in Spanish, he said to me, well, that's simple because all marginals recognize each other. So with respect to our theme today, as I mentioned, it was in response to these questions I had posed myself about what is the art movement of our time, and also to in what respect does it represent or reflect our time?
Just a little short info. The materials that are illustrations for the talk and references, they will be provided on the chat. So this is just to make everybody know. Okay. Sorry not to say it earlier.
In one of them, as I started to mention, what you'll see, it just looks simply like a jewelry box with a very sort of traditional kind of old-fashioned diamond ring. And ordinarily, it would be impossible for almost anyone to even identify this as an art object. Well, this we could also maybe say about a ready-made. But a ready-made has the distinction of being placed in a space for viewing art. And it's that space for viewing art that distinguishes it from being, say, a functional object, just like a bottle dryer in a bar. If it's in a bar, it's a bottle dryer. But the moment you put it in an art gallery or museum, it becomes a ready-made, because the space for viewing art becomes the aesthetic constitutor of the object. And I think that's why Sadan Afif, who's one of the artists I mentioned as a metonymic narrative artist, having a special love and affinity for Duchamp, he said that one of the projects he always wanted to realize was to take some of Duchamp's ready-made and in the course of the exhibition, move them back and forth between the exhibition space and their functional environments, precisely in order to underline this point. So the diamond ring that you would see in a box, no one really needs to see a photograph of it because everyone knows what a diamond ring looks like. And we would have a difficulty to know even that it's a work of art, but it is a work of metonymic narrative by Jill Magid. And for such a work, it's imperative, in order to read it, to know the narrative associated with it. And Jill is one of the only artists of this school who uses film. as her way of conveying the narrative associated with her art objects. And in this film, which is called The Proposal, she recounts the whole story. She always had taken an interest in the great Mexican modernist architect, Luis Barragan. And she discovered that a billionaire Swiss industrialist had decided to marry, and that his future wife was a big fan of Barragan. And he decided that as a way of giving her an engagement present, instead of buying an expensive diamond ring, he would buy an expensive archive, which was the entire archive of Luis Barragan, and give it to her as a gift for their engagement. But what disturbed the artist about this is that once it were given as a gift, it would be in effect removed from public access, so that scholars, researchers, and even just fans of Barragan's work, as she was, would have no access to this valuable historical archive of his. And that the same would apply to scholars. They would also have no access. So she came up with this idea. She discovered a Swiss company that could take any carbon-based material, including ashes, and put them in a machine that would compress them with tons and tons and tons of pounds, and thereby turn them from carbon into a diamond. She then discovered that Barragan had been cremated. There were ashes in a sort of mausoleum that were his mortal remains. And she asked the family for permission to exhume these ashes and transport them to this company in Switzerland, where they were compressed and converted to a diamond, which she then mounted on a ring. And then she went to the romantic industrialist and said, I give you this ring, and I want to make you this proposal. Would you please offer her this concentrated version of the mortal remains of Barragan in the form of a diamond rather than the archive? Then the archive would always remain open to the public and to scholars, and the legacy of Barragan could continue for the world. Wouldn't this be a more fitting tribute to your love and for her love of culture? In the end, he refused. The archive was taken out of circulation from the world, but the ring remains with that diamond in it as an object of art, which I call metonymic for this reason. A metonym, of course, it's a Greek word that comes mostly from our study of literature, and it's one of the many Greek words we apply from the study of literature to the study of art, which is something we might always remember anytime we use a word like context, which may not be Greek, but certainly which comes from the study of texts. A metonym is merely a substitute word that symbolizes something that it is associated with. And that thing that it is associated with does not really have a physical embodiment. In this way, it's very different from the word synecdoche, which is simply a part for a whole of something that has a physical embodiment. So when Homer wrote in the Iliad, 10,000 sails set forth, everyone knew that he was referring to ships, because the sail was a part of the whole ship that could represent it. Similarly, a metonym represents something that does not have a physical embodiment like a ship, but which is associated with it. And the most common type of metonym are the names of cities that represent governments. When we say Washington, D.C. Decreed, or Washington, D.C. signed a treaty with, what we mean, of course, is the United States government, and often we mean many things associated with it, including an entire ideology. If we use the term Hollywood, yes, Hollywood is a real city, but as a metonym, it represents not only the film industry, but a whole ideology of making films that includes such things as a happy ending, a sympathetic hero, and later on, the average length of a shot under 5 seconds. And so in this sense, I believe that the term metonym is not only applicable to language, but also to art objects, that a work of art can be a metonym. And that's why I believe that that diamond ring that no one will see until they open the site is a metonym for an entire narrative of the industrialist's love for his fiancée, of the story of Luis Barragan and how his archive was taken out of association by a certain kind of arrogance that comes with a great fortune, and of an artist's attempt to resist this kind of arrogance and liberate this archive and the memory of this great architect for the world. So in that sense, the diamond ring serves as a metonym. But all these artists that I've mentioned in the list work this way. They work with an object that you may find completely unidentifiable or even unidentifiable as as an art object, but which has this kind of story associated with it. Now, in the case of Jill Magid, there's a film, and one can watch an entire film, which is about 90 minutes, and know the story, and even see images of the very mausoleum from which she exhumed the ashes of Barragan. But there are some artists who even have written entire novels for this narrative. One of them is Edmund Duvall. If you go to see a work by Edmund Duvall, as I did at the Gagosian Gallery in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills, some years ago, all I could see was a black shelf. It was made of plywood, very hastily assembled and sprayed with black paint. You could see that it had certain niches in it that made it suitable for displaying small objects. And the novel that he wrote is the name of one of these small objects. The novel is called The Hare with Amber Eyes. And the hare with amber eyes is a very small object, smaller than my thumb, which is a miniature sculpture of a rabbit in white porcelain with amber eyes. And this genre of sculpture is very common in Japan. They're called netsuke. And they are originally, they have a function. They are used in place of buttons to fasten a particular kind of belt to a traditional Japanese garment. And it turns out that Edmund Duvall's family, the Uffizi family, which was a very prominent Jewish family in Vienna when the onslaught of National Socialism arrived in 1938, and everything of theirs was confiscated because they were a prosperous Jewish family, including an immense collection that they had of hundreds and hundreds of these netsuke sculptures. And this fact gradually led the artist to research into the history of his family and the history of these sculptures, and even to go to Japan and live in Japan, where he became himself a very accomplished master of ceramics, so that he was quite capable of making netsuke himself and appreciating them with much greater depth. And so very often in an Edmund Duvall exhibition, all you will see are these tiny little sculptures, no bigger than half the size of my thumb, but which are resonant with this entire narrative of meaning related to this historical cataclysm and the suffering and really destruction of his family and his family heritage, and their own contribution to culture by collecting an exhibition of artworks. And I brought this up with him when he gave a lecture at the Akademie der Künste in Berlin, and he thanked me. He agreed with me. This was indeed an appropriate way of describing his work as a metonym for that narrative. And of course, anyone can read this wonderful narrative by buying the novel, which is The Hare with Amber Eyes. And another artist also wrote really what's really more than a novel, but a collection of texts. And that's Maitu Perret, who is a sort of half Vietnamese, half Swiss artist based in Geneva. And in the 90s, she conceived of a utopian project called the Crystal Frontier, which became the subject of her novel. And the novel is written partly by the narrator Maitu Perret and partly by these women who are characters in the Crystal Frontier, which is a utopian settlement of women who go to the American West to establish a new society which is matriarchal and essentially not capitalistic at all, but which is in accordance with their own utopian ideas of separation from these tendencies in society. And the characters contribute many things to this narrative, which is collected in anthology form in her book, which include diaries, sometimes just daily to-do lists of what people in the Crystal Frontier would do with their lives in the course of a day. Even love letters. And all of these are brought to life. And so in this sense, you have texts which are written by the artists and which serve as metonyms, if you will, or I'm sorry, they serve as the narratives and the objects that come from them, which in the case of Edmund Duvall are netsuke, in the case of Maitu Perret are a variety of different kinds of objects that resemble minimalist sculptures at times, and sculptures of the very women who inhabit the Crystal Frontier that are done in white resin. Those objects are metonyms for visual metonyms for those narratives, of which they also claim authorship. Some use film, some use tiny ceramic sculptures, some use big sculptures, some use even painting. And an example of an artist that uses painting is one whom you also have an image, and you'll see that's the Chinese artist Jia, whom I know quite well and whom you know, Dominic. And what you'll see in those paintings is an array of Chinese characters rendered in such a way as to reveal wave patterns in their arrangement and composition. Now, I must tell you that no one needs to be literate in Chinese in order to appreciate the formal characteristics of this work. But this work also has a narrative associated with it, which has a very strong relationship to Chinese society, because Chinese society had thousands of years of artworks associated with the Chinese character. The characters were often written by the very poets who were using them to write down their own poetic compositions. And the formal aspect of the character was a very important of the poetic part of the poetic process. So we could say that very often a very heavy or thick stroke could be used to represent a very sad or gloomy poem. And there's a very famous poem from the Tang about a woman dancing a sword mime. And so the strokes of the characters are very fluid and very very dynamic, so that the character's formal aspect reflects their semantic content. All this was broken, these thousands of years of tradition, in 1955, when Chairman Mao decided to make character simplification and initiated the character simplification program. Well, very often the people who participated in doing this were hardly literate in Chinese characters, but they found ways to reduce the numbers of strokes in them and to destroy the pictographic element that most Chinese characters had, and to separate entirely their pictographic component or the ideographic component from their final aspect. This, of course, was an act of cultural destruction that went even further, because part of the simplification program meant that perhaps 2/3 of Chinese characters were then eliminated entirely from the Chinese lexicon. And this impoverishment of language, as well as the impoverishment of the visual culture of China that derived from the artful representation of Chinese characters, was all destroyed in one stroke. And today, as this policy has continued by law, it is illegal to print a book with traditional Chinese characters in the People's Republic. It remains legal in Taiwan and Hong Kong, where there was no simplification program. And the literacy rates of those two places also make a lie of the ostensible rationale for making simplified characters, because simplified characters did not increase literacy among Chinese people. The literacy rate in Taiwan, where traditional characters with more strokes are used, is higher than the literacy rate of Switzerland. So this was a canard, that it was a helpful thing done for the benefit of the illiterate. It became, in the end, purely an act of cultural destruction that also made it very difficult for contemporary Chinese people to read books that were published before the Chinese character simplification was initiated. And therefore, people were also cut off from an immense historical and literary tradition. And there you see the real motive for such an act, which, like most motivations of the regime, were simply political, so that the regime entirely could have absolute control over every published text. Not only its content, but the ability of people to read it became subject to this mandate. In that sense, it was much more ambitious, I think, than many other acts of cultural destruction, like when the Taliban just dynamited the Bamiyan Buddhas and destroyed these sculptures. So when someone looks at one of these paintings, they might just see a wonderful abstract pattern. But there is a narrative associated with it for which the painting is a metonym. And that is this history of cultural destruction. When I mentioned this to one of the curators who made an exhibition on this work, he said immediately, well, cultural destruction is the history of the human race. He said there was a study done that said, well, 96% of all the culture that's ever been produced by humanity has been destroyed. And what we have left is maybe 3 or 4%. This is nothing. Well, I would not like to say this is nothing to any students who are aspiring to make contributions to culture through their artwork. But I think with this history, we should always bear in mind that this is an ever-present danger that seems to me encoded in the history of our civilization, and for which these artworks also serve as a kind of warning. This is not the only metonymic narrative work that's related to language. Another one is a work by Julieta Randa, a Mexican artist. And there what you'll see, it looks like a piece of minimalist abstraction superimposed on the empty elements of a crossword puzzle, which are just black and white squares. And gradually everyone will see this image, but it has a very important narrative associated with it, which I've enclosed with the image. It's also very much related to language and how language can be lost. And she uses a metaphor to evoke the survival of this lost language, which are, she says, in the Arctic permafrost, people have discovered microbes that live in temperatures that could be 60 below zero. But when a thaw comes and when the water liquefies and the ice becomes water once again, these microbes come back to life. And the ground for them to live becomes exposed. And they become living testaments to the sort of life that existed and the sort of environments that existed before this permafrost cast everything into suspended animation. and that this happens with language too, that language carries its own etymology and its own history, which gradually can be revealed by subsequent events. So this is another, we're talking here about how narrative is the real referent of an artwork. And narrative by definition is language, but there are some works of metonymic narrative whose very subject is language. And these are two examples of them. I would like to add, if I may, that I'm using certain very old-fashioned fundamentals that I assume in approaching this subject. One of them has to do with another Greek word, which is mimesis. I'm one of those people who believe that all art is mimetic, that it's a representation of reality. Now, some people would object and they would say, well, mimesis usually refers to an image or to a like, and an image means likeness. What about something like a ready-made, which we mentioned before, which is not an image at all, and it's not even a likeness? I would argue that this work is still mimetic because it represents the very idea that it embodies, which is that the space in which something occurs is its aesthetic constitutor, and that when an object has function, when it has a conventional function, it can no longer be a work of art, really. And that's for a reason that I would like to go to in my next presupposition. Of course, as we remain with mimesis for one moment, we presuppose a dialectical structure of creation where we have the affirmation, which is the artist, the negation, which is the referent that the artist is representing. The synthesis is a work of art, which is part the artist and part the referent, and yet which transcends them both. But the other rather old-fashioned idea that I would like to evoke is one that comes from Da Vinci, which is the idea that a work of art is fully constituted to the degree that it is made by the artist. And we get this idea from a text, which is contained within a text, because Da Vinci wrote a book that I hope everyone who studies painting will know, which is his treatise on painting, Trattata sulla pittura. And this book contains a text within it which is known as the paragone, or the comparison, which is his comparison of sculpture and painting. And in effect, what Da Vinci says is that the aesthetic problem with sculpture is that there are many things about it that are not determined by the artist. The artist usually cannot determine the point of view. He cannot impose the point of view, especially in Da Vinci's day, couldn't control the lighting. A sculpture must respect certain elements of engineering and gravity, otherwise it will fall over. And therefore, he said, painting is a superior medium, because in a painting, the artist can control everything, the point of view, the light, the perspective. If he wants or she wants, the artist can make the painting have a cubist form that enable people to see different points of view simultaneously. And therefore, for Da Vinci, it is more fully constituted as a work of art because, to a greater degree, it is made by the artist and everything is determined by the artist. This is another reason why a work of architecture cannot be a work of art, because it has its function. It has to have windows we can see through. It has to have doors that someone who's the size of a human being can walk through. It probably has fire regulations, insurance regulations, and many other criteria that are not determined by the artist. And therefore, it may be beautiful, it may be aesthetic, it may have many things in common with a work of art, but too much of it is not determined by the artist. And therefore, according to these criteria, it's not a work of art, it's a work of design. And that's why I would urge every student of painting to consider carefully all the criteria that the artist can control, including the defined image field, the fact of why make a painting? What is it about the painting that must be rendered in the painting so that the medium, the choice of the medium itself is not arbitrary, but necessary for the idea that the painting evinces. in that way, it's a privileged medium, as certainly Da Vinci would insist. And going back to this point that a work of art is fully constituted to the degree that it is made by the artist, I would say that, and we said already from mimesis that every work of art has a referent, that which it represents. Well, if the referent is a narrative that is made by the artist, then that means that the artist's making is colonizing even the referent, which is not something we could say if an artist were just making a drawing of a tree. The artist is not making the tree. The artist is merely selecting it as a referent. But in the case when the referent is a narrative, and I think this is the rationale for this school of work, that it extends to a degree not seen before the advent of metonymic narrative, the degree of the artist's making, because the referent, even the referent, is made by the artist. And that's why I think it's distinctive, and why I think it's justified as a movement and as we could say, a step forward in the history of art. In order to historicize it, I would like to say that it begins in the 90s. And because Mathieu Perret's first novel text is made in 99 about the crystal frontier. And many of the artists working today in this school began their careers in the 90s. And this is also an important historical fact for another reason, because the 90s were ruled by an extreme assertion of relativism in artwork, and also forms of relativism that posed an attack on the idea of authorship. And what I have in mind specifically are two principal movements in the 90s, both of which are in books by the French choreographer Nicolas Bourriaud. One is Relational Aesthetics. In Relational Aesthetics, I mean, the artists we're thinking of here, in case anybody has any doubts, are Dominique Forster, Liam Gillick, Pierre Huyghe, Philippe Perreno, and many others, most of whom are represented in Berlin by Esther Schipper Gallery. And essentially, Relational Aesthetics says that the artist is not the author of the work. The author of the work is the receiver or the group of receivers. So the most paradigmatic example of this, for example, is the Thai artist Rikrit Tirivanija, who made a work called Dinner in the Gallery. He cooked a dinner in the gallery, and it was filled with, the table was filled with collectors who were enjoying the dinner and talking among themselves. He insists that the dinner is not the work of art. The work of art is the conversation that occurs between the collectors. This resembles a work by Liam Gillick, in which you'll just see a minimalist-looking grid of plastic. In film, we call them gels. They're colored, transparent plastic pieces that cover geometric forms and filter the light through them. He calls this a conversation piece for the same reason that the receiver's conversation is the work of art. The The second movement in this regard, which is also a book by Bourriot, is called post-production. And post-production takes the view that a work of art is really a sort of agglomeration of other people's works of art that are assembled, I would say, arbitrarily, in a way that denies the intentionality of the original authors, of the constituents of that assembly. So perhaps the most famous work of post-production was Christian Marclay's The Clock, which won the Golden Lion at Venice, I believe, in 2011. And this was just an assembly of 24 hours of segments of other people's films, usually films that included an image of a clock. And it took 24 hours to play this work. This was an assembly of other people's work. So there was no piece of film which was ever shot by Christian Marclay in that work. It was an assembly of other people's works. And this is also, as you can see, a sort of denial of, or an attack, if you will, an implicit attack on individual authorship, which is an idea that goes back to French relativist thought to the 60s, when Roland Barthes made his famous book that said, "What is an author?" Or The Death of the Author, which is also, an Irishman wrote a riposte to that, which is called The Life and Death of the Author, which was a repudiation of Barthes' idea. I believe it was called The Life and Death and Rebirth of the Author. Well, I'm so old-fashioned that I come from the view that a work of art presupposes authorship. And one of the things that I notice about metonymic narrative is that I believe in some ways it arose as a repudiation of this attack on authorship in the 90s, because by insisting that the referent of the work of art is a narrative by the artist, you are extending the realm of authorship and therefore reasserting radically the role of the artist as author of the work, because the artist is the author in effect of two things: a narrative, which is a dematerialized element by definition because it's a text, and a physical embodiment of the work, which is the metonym of that narrative. So you have an inherent tension between a work of art's narrative aspect and its metonymic or embodied aspect. And both of these pose a radical reassertion of authorship. And by extension, I would say they implicitly reassert this old idea of Da Vinci's that I mentioned earlier, that a work of art is fully constituted to the degree that it is made by the author or made by the artist. Well, I hope this is clear, and that everyone who has access to the images I submitted and the artist list will have an interesting time to see how this theory of art, how diverse it is, how it's applied by so many different artists in so many different nations with so many different media and in so many different ways. So I hope this will continue to prove a fruitful path of discovery, and that the next time you go into an art exhibition and you blink your eyes and you say, how is it possible to read this work? You'll suspect that there's a narrative and search it out. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for having me. And I think maybe we can finish there if you like.
Well, I think we can just start, Drew.
Of course, I'm grateful for any questions.
Well, I maybe have one, or maybe it's a comment, or another little story. Thank you, first of all, Drew, for this very, very clear and enlightening proposition. And I think it is...
When you say clear, Ulrich, it's the greatest flattery I could possibly have.
I hope I don't insult you.
Not at all. On the contrary, it's...
No, it was very, very clear. And what's more, I think you hit a nerve of something that probably many of us experience and maybe have not, I mean, talking for myself now, have not been able to pinpoint so as clearly as you, with such an interesting theory also behind it. So what I can say, number one, I was a student of art history, art theory, art history more, I think in the late 70s or early 80s in Bochum, not with Gadamer, but with somebody who was, let's say, close to this school, Max Imdahl.
Yeah.
And I remember that there was a point that he made saying that in modernism, iconography was being replaced by the artist theory. So looking at the Van Duisburg painting that was that worked with verticals and horizontals, and in that case not with diagonals, you had no chance.
Then Mondrian would have hated him too much.
Well, no, the point is you had no chance to know what it means that now Van Duisburg shows up with vertical and horizontals. Is he a renegade? Did he finally understand that he made a big mistake? Or is this system of verticality and horizontality another deviation from Mondrian or whatever? You could only know that if you knew the theory. So I'm wondering if what you place in the 90s, if it is not possibly an aspect or even, well, something connected to modernism itself. I don't know.
I would hazard a conjecture. I would say that for me, always the key idea of modernism was the idea of self-referentiality. And Picasso practically admits this in the book written by Françoise Gillot in her memoir of their relationship. He says, yes, the point of Cubism was I wanted the work to refer only to itself. And he says it to her very explicitly. And so I think if a work is referring to its own theory, it still has a referent. And the goal of modernism really is which you see taken to a much more extreme level in minimalism. And Frank Stella practically says this all the time. It's even spoken by him in lectures that are available on YouTube. And I urge everyone to listen to Frank Stella, except that I disagree with him terribly in this respect. That really a work must have no referent and refer only to itself, which is a more extreme, and minimalism became for him a more extreme iteration of this idea of the modernism of the generation of his parents and grandparents.
Okay. Well, it's still.
It fails.
Hmm?
In minimalism, in both Stella and Judd, it fails.
Well, I thought this point that I tried, or this what I recounted here, I thought was interesting because because it questions in some sort of way the specificity of what you have exposed. It's let's say it's time-wise localization in the 90s. But maybe we can leave this open for the time being. The other observation I made in relation to what you have been talking about is a repeated experience of mine walking into a gallery, and exactly as you described it, really not knowing what this is about.
But it's a shocking thing when a person with your background, who is literally someone who had formal studies in art history and art theory, still has this reaction.
Oh, definitely, and necessarily so, as you explained.
Imagine someone without your degree of education or specialty.
Well, and then, you know, because I get recognized in the gallery, so the gallerist comes and starts to tell me about this thing, right? And this is something which I find very often very problematic, because this metonymic quality of the artwork, which is intentional, obviously, is sort of subverted by a completely informal, not addressed kind of narrative that is offered by the press release, or the gallerist, or somebody standing next to you, etc., right?
I've had the same experience.
Huh?
I've had the same experience.
Yeah, exactly. And well, the quality of
usually I feel like slapping the gallerist.
Yes, right. Well, the quality probably of the example that you gave is that the narrative is formalized, right? It's not just an object the artist is offering, but he's also offering the referent in a formalized and complex and way, right?
Not always, but most of the time there's some iteration of the narrative,
right,
in the form of a text that becomes accessible either on the internet or
right,
exhibition space.
And yet, to me, it often feels sort of elitist, you know, as if only an elite, the what you call these people, the well, the people who are introduced, you know, I forgot now, as if all, huh?
The conoscenti.
Yes, like something like this. The initiated ones, you know, an elite, as if only an elite of the initiated had an access to the revelation, let's say, to the narrative, to all these wonderful stories that you have shared with us.
More than minimalism, conceptual art, or Italian Renaissance art?
Well, well, Italian Renaissance, it's something different, because there you probably are talking about an iconography that is sort of like a shared patrimony. With minimalism, as you explained, there is no referent, so there can be, in that sense, no sense of elitism. How do you feel about my feeling of often being excluded, let's say, or of being the surprised witness of an inner circle, of a kind of Rosarian or Freimaurer kind of secret society that you know, has access to these often, as you explained, very extravagant stories and narratives.
I think it's a natural consequence of the condition of art today, that it's a sort of luxury fetish object for the rich, and this is a sort of analogy, because it's a sort of it's also a sort of luxury fetish object for the theoretician to understand, and this, I also feel alienated by this anyway. So when I suspect that there's a narrative at work, I hunt like mad to track it down.
Apparently, what I heard from one of the gallerists, the best way to sell work of art is to say to the collector that you're not ready for this yet.
Yeah.
Which is part of the question that I have, Drew, which just came to my mind during your wonderful speech, which is how would you consider this metonymic the paradigm that you were discussing as a form of the resistance? A resistance, I mean that the resistance that I could draw onto your quote from Da Vinci, meaning that the resistance of artists versus the institution, meaning that somehow artist who becomes involved with an institutional narrative becomes not an artist anymore, but the cultural designer. So then, thinking of creating the narrative by the artist instead of the institution, artists to me seem to claim back what's being taken away to him, in terms of making him to reside to the function of being just a cultural designer who designs functional objects which serve the purpose of the institution.
Well, our society has reduced artists in many respects to people who make decorations for the rich, which is a very ignoble condition for a station in life and in the history of culture that is intrinsically very noble. And so I do think that, in a sense, there is a lot of truth in what you say, Dominic. And Erika Hoffman, who is known more as a collector than a theorist, when she became aware of this theory, she said, I suppose it is natural that the artist should wish to reassert the ability to make a narrative, because we live in a time where everybody can now make their own narrative, having already rejected all the traditional narratives that have been offered to us by traditional mythology and traditional religion and traditional adherence to various political ideologies. And we also have, to make these new narratives, the artists also have at their disposal technology, which gives them access to so much of this, instantaneous access to so much of this information. She said, in that sense, this work is something that does represent this time in history in a way that some of the earlier movements we mentioned represented so obviously their times. But I think what you're saying is true.
So,
Of course, you know, the biggest narrative of all is really crazy. because if you look at an artist whom I admire very much, Adrian Piper, she also has a doctorate in philosophy from Harvard, and she has been a member for many years of the Harvard philosophy faculty. And she wrote a book which is available on the internet for free, which is called Rationality and the Structure of the Self. It took her 36 years to write it, and it's approximately 1,200 pages of very dense analytic philosophy. And over the years, I sort of accustomed myself to reading analytic philosophy of this caliber. But even though I'm rather accustomed to this kind of prose, I found it a challenge to read. But her other career is being an artist who's also had a big solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And she claims that this text informs all her artwork, and in effect, that it's impossible adequately to look at her art without knowing this text. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge to read. I found, you know, I have such a distaste for relativism that I read a book by another analytic philosopher, Thomas Nagel, I guess in Germany would say Nagel, and he wrote The Definitive Repudiation of Relativism, which is called The Last Word. And without realizing it, 30 years before, he had written The Definitive Repudiation of Object-Oriented Ontology, which is his essay called What It's Like to Be a Bat. It says, in effect, that because a bat has a completely different sensory apparatus, it's impossible adequately for us to imagine the perception of the world that a bat would have. And therefore, it makes no sense to speak of object-oriented ontology, which is supposed to assert that we have the perception of the world of the object. And reading The Last Word as a repudiation of relativism, it required a lot of concentration from me. I really had to concentrate a lot to read it, because the prose is very dense, and these kinds of philosophers, they tend to write their books first in the language of symbolic logic, and then translate them into a natural language like English. So in the translation will account for every potential ambiguity that the language of symbolic logic exposes. And that's why in a book by somebody like Saul Kripke, you'll have a 4-page footnote to explain the use of a comma. And similarly with Adrian Piper, these techniques make the book extremely rigorous. In fact, I would say books that are written in that way, you cannot attack the structure of the argument. They're too rigorous. You can only attack the premises. And so I would say that to read Rationality and the Structure in the Self, which I would encourage all my friends to try, it's demanding, but it would be very helpful then if you want to look at an Adrian Piper work and not have this feeling of that we mentioned before of being at a loss to read it because the narrative is absent and we don't see the referent. I probably should have included a link to the free online copies of Rationality and the Structure of the Self, but I think this might make everyone hate me. But Ulrich, I must say that this implicit aspiration that your remark revealed, that art should be accessible to all, I think that's a noble aspiration. But for whatever reason, it just hasn't developed that way.
No, but this was not really what. I would not ask for that, or not at this moment. No, I was rather thinking if you were not well. You said a lot when you told us what Erika Hoffman told you, and when you made the link to the current possibility for everybody to publish their own stories, right?
And to have access to the information to make them.
Exactly. So I was wondering if this kind of work that you refer to, if it had not a tendency of being this kind of idiosyncratic thing that is closed onto itself. You know, that is, let's say, yeah, self-referential and closed on itself.
I'm sure that's true, but I would also wish to make another point, which is that even though many artists are working this way in the last 25 years, and even though this tendency has produced some important and interesting work, that doesn't mean that, you know, if you were working in 1965, you had to be a pop artist or you had to be a conceptual artist. No, because an artist is someone, in my view, who by definition, they have this sort of natural antenna for the A, and however they choose to work is the right way in that sense, because they are natural conduits of the zeitgeist in this sense, no matter what way they choose to work. So one thing I would not wish for is for the students to say to themselves, well, if I'm not working in this way, I'm not with the times, or I'm not working in a way that I should in order to be part of the cool guys.
Yeah, sure. It's clear. This is very clear. But we're trying to, how to say, to understand these phenomena, right? And you gave a very interesting material here that one may try to understand.
My goal for the students is that they, you know, part of their job in being cultural producers is to be able to read culture, and inevitably they're going to go to art exhibitions and be confronted with these problems of legibility. And I'm hoping that I can offer at least part of a tool with which to approach this work.
Right, and you did. Last time, following the lecture of David Elliott, unfortunately, technically, I was not able to participate. But if I had been able, I would have said that it was curious for me to see in myself how much more interesting I found his show on the wounds and the pain than the show on the happiness. I thought the artworks in the pain part, you know, they were so much more interesting than the works in the happiness part. And one thing that I found great in these works that he showed, like Wirtschaftswerte of Beuys and the Arte Povera things, etc., was something that I call embodiment. And of course, this is exactly what the metonymic narrative art doesn't do, embodiment. And part of what is so fascinating there, I would say, is a sense of ambivalence. However, in the work that you presented here, it seems to me that it's completely closed in the way that everything is explained, and there's no deviation. There's also no space for anybody to, let's say, enjoy or hate or whatever, ambivalence. You know, it is. I mean, the ring that that I can imagine. It has its narrative, and this narrative is completely conclusive. It's a closed story, right? And once you got it, you really got it, and you don't need to look at it ever again. And that is maybe a specificity that I've been irritated about.
Well, if we look at Michelangelo's David, we know the narrative, we know the story. And yet, despite that we know the story from scripture, which is also very specific, there's yet another range of implications of the work that have to do with the nature of the Renaissance, its reification of the classical, its emphasis on the human rather than the divine, and so many other elements that we can still manage to see in the work despite this very specific communal narrative of scripture. And I'm hoping the same applies in this case, but I fear that in many cases it is a closed system, exactly as you say.
Yeah,
that's
to be explored, I think.
That's really interesting, Drew. I mean, what you just said, I mean, from my position of an artist, thinking about the others that are somehow involved with the whole phenomena of contemporary art, meaning, how would you perceive the place for the middleman in this situation, as long as artist is claiming to take over the whole field? Where is the place for curators, or where is the place for art critics? As long as the system is closed or controlled by the artist to the extent that you've mentioned.
As a person who basically, it's an exaggeration, but I make a living as an art critic.
Yeah, that's my question. That's my question.
It's, of course, an extremely humble living, but nevertheless, I would say that the role of the curator, the critic, the middleman, as you say, the cultural middleman, is to provide the receiver with access to the narrative in this case. Because the work of art is really two things. It's its material embodiment and its dematerialized narrative. And the complete experience demands exposure to the narrative as well as the material embodiment.
But then what then? Sorry, this is the foolish superficiality I'm applying. But so what in what sort of form this would take? Because in my simple mind, I just understand that as long as artist is controlling the story and controlling the input, which is an object, to the story, which is completely controlled and defined.
I hope this.
How would you see yourself in terms of providing this the link, or as long as artist also determines the link?
I would imagine that I'm the person who writes the text that accompanies the exhibition on the internet, that makes this narrative explicit. But that I would do so only with scrupulous attention to the artist's thoughts on the matter.
Right.
Well, I think,
There's also go on, Ulrich.
No, I thought it was, Dominic, a very interesting point that you made. And there is, of course, a contemporary phenomenon where artists turn into curators, right? I mean, this is quite a sort of implicit in this sort of procedures.
Yes, this was another sin of the 90s that followed relational aesthetics and post-production. The artist as curator.
Well, but it's completely consistent with the metonymic narrative, of course, you know, where the artist presents the metonymic object, where the artist constructs the narrative, and also organizes the relation, let's say. Completely consistent, I would say.
Of course, with the actual curating goes, as you know better than I do because you've made so many exhibitions, all these things that Professor Beatrice von Bismarck loves to write about, like hospitality, the significance of the place of the exhibition, the temporality, the significance of the timing of the exhibition, and all these things related to exhibition presentation strategy that have a relation, a potential relation to the artwork. So I remember when we made an exhibition about collage, because collage is juxtaposition by definition. We managed to find a space in the building in across from the Gedächtniskirche, Bikini, Berlin. Because it's in two sections, the building, a lower section and an upper section. And this building, therefore, itself was a juxtaposition of two structures. And so the presentation always involves so many potential elements that are, I think, still potentially proposed by the curator or the exhibition maker.
Would then the artist, speaking of this paradigm of a formula that you provided us with, my very simple question is would then the artist within this setup, meaning that he's in control with the object and he's in control with the narrative, should be wise enough to not to provide the whole clues? If you know what I mean. Because then if he provides the whole clues, then there's nothing else to do, really. It becomes didactic. So how would you see this? How would you see my should I, as an artist or a painter, be clever enough to expose my somehow
well, the two exhibitions
within a project problem, rather than being within the full control of my project.
The two exhibitions that I made in this school was one of Philip Lachenmann, and the other was an artist from India called Shrestha Rit Premnath, who teaches at the Parsons School in New York. And in both cases, I sat at the entrance and I admonished the people coming to the exhibition to read a text which I had written based on my conversation with the artist about what the narrative was, and I would hand it to them personally, and then I would, in both cases, the artists were not present.
Maybe that's the way.
So Of course, this is not always the case. Sadhana Fif made a big such presentation in the Natural History Museum in Berlin, and with a big orchestra also associated with it. And he was not the orchestra director, but he was standing in front of the orchestra, between the orchestra and some of the objects that were metonyms of the idea of the work, the narrative of the work. So physically, his role was as the primary receiver of his own work. And this occurred to me as something which might be repeatable. Especially since my own opinion is that there's a revolution going on to make sure that the manner of reception is more made by the artist than had been before. That the artist has much more control over the reception of the work. And I think this is built in to the way many artists now are making their work currently. I mean, recently, Marcus Steinweg, you know, he also does sort of neo-conceptual art in which the work is entirely made of texts. And I had been looking at his work, for his artwork, his own artwork, for many years. And he made one that was radically different from the ones he had made in years before. Essentially, there were rows and rows of letters. And with great difficulty, it was possible, on the one hand, to read with a lot of concentration a consistent paragraph. If you sort of squinted your eyes and forced yourself to see continuity in those letters, there was a consistent paragraph that enunciated the theme of the work. But then, once you got away from that, which was quite normal, you saw the work as a formal arrangement, which he also had intended, and one which linked certain ideas, because often his text works are like organograms that show the relationship between philosophical ideas. And so therefore, it was almost like an optical illusion, where you could see a legible paragraph, and then you could squint your eyes and the legible paragraph disappeared and it became something else. So the artist imposed upon me two receptions that were consecutive. And I realized that this was another way of making something that was more than just in metonymic narrative, where the referent is also made by the artist. Here, the reception was made by the artist, and its consecutive nature. It was split in two and rendered consecutive. And I think this control of the reception and imposition of a very, if you will, idiosyncratic reception is characteristic of a lot of new work that's being made today.
One more question, because you have, speaking of a jazz painting and a passage in terms of the linguistic eradication also that she draws onto in her work, it just draws me somehow on the question, how would you perceive that kind of metonymic narrative strategy used by artists in terms of the censorship as a problem?
It's a terrible problem, and it's a problem that,
or as a tool.
It's part of the reason why her work probably cannot be exhibited in China. But we live in a time where, especially in Russia, not only are artists under attack, but curators. And quite a number of curators have been imprisoned in recent years in Russia. And Russia has become a very dangerous place for anyone involved in the plastic arts, whether as a curator or critic or artist. In that sense, it's not quite a reversion to the horrors of Stalinist times, but it's bad. And one has a choice to do things like emigrate to Berlin or simply exercise a great deal of caution. And to some degree, self-censorship. But now we have all sorts of self-censorship, especially in the United States, because in the United States, the primary criterion for aesthetic evaluation is the identity of the artist. And to deviate from that norm leads to cancellation and leads to many terrible consequences, which are not, strictly speaking, state imposed. No. Because officially the law allows for constitutionally protected freedom of speech. But in practice, it's rather like the Cultural Revolution or Stalinist times when it comes to certain issues.
Would you then consider the metonymic narrative as a kind of a way out of the censorship, or the strategy that can be applied to resist the censorship in its obvious ways, how it works?
The irony is that, another irony is that sometimes the obscurity of a work of art can be its own protection. When Gramsci was in Mussolini's prison and was writing the prison notebooks, he wrote about his socialist program for the future, pretending that he was writing about ancient history. And so the censors, Mussolini's censors who read the works, they were confused because they thought he was writing about the classical times, and therefore the works were allowed to be published. And there's a Chinese analogy to that. A philosopher of the Qing period, say the 17th century, early 17th century, Wang Fuzhi, who was admired by Mao Zedong, he was subject to Qing censorship. With the Qing, of course, were not ethnically Chinese people; they were Manchu, and they carefully read all his texts in order to censor them, because he was someone who wanted to restore the ethnically Chinese dynasty that preceded it, the Ming, from 1368 to 1644, and they carefully read his work, but he would use another trick which was even more obscure. He was a scholar of ancient Chinese, and the original book of poetry, they also call it the Book of Songs, was written in the 7th century BC. but the forms of Chinese characters that were used then very often had completely different meanings than the ones that were formally the same as the modern ones, but had acquired new meanings. And therefore, he was able to escape censorship by using them in this way. But only the most educated people who are not only educated, but who are also concentrated in the use of those characters in the 7th century BC could have a hope of ever understanding his meaning. He was also saved, but the authorities got his revenge because later Mao Zedong, who was also quite a student of Gramsci, he considered Wang Fuzhi as a kind of hero for his resistance to the last imperial dynasty. And the irony is that he himself imposed the most extreme cultural limitations imaginable, starting in 65. So I think its obscurity can be a protection in some ways, but if the artist is careful with the narrative in such a way that it's not only obscure to the censors, but also expressed in a way that cannot attract their weaponry, then the artist can win. But like so many things, this is also a matter of luck. I think always when Napoleon was choosing his commanders, people were eager for those jobs, and they talked about their credentials and how skilled they were as military tacticians. And he said, I don't care about that. I just want a man who's lucky. As for the students, are we making any sense?
Hello, students.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Oh, that's already a positive. When I was very young, I used to have a professor who told me, when you reach a certain age, you realize whatever you don't know, you just have to make up. And I tried not to overdo it in this. But I hope I answered the questions I started out with, which was, what is the unifying movement of this period, and in what sense does it reflect this period? And does it have a rationale that transcends its mere presence? Because, of course, we all know, I think, that the enemy of an artwork is always arbitrariness. It's always something that's there for its own sake. But every aspect of an artwork, including its medium and genre, must transcend its mere presence.
So where is your belief in zeitgeist come from?
Well, I think in some ways we all had some some things filter down to us from Hegel, and the historicism that succeeded him with people like Fackenheim in the 20th century, the so-called left-wing Hegelian historicists. And I think they somehow they all had an influence on us, and we believe that there is such a thing as a zeitgeist.
In other words, you don't read James Joyce, who famously wrote in the Portrait of the Artist of the Young Man that history is a nightmare from which we try to awake.
Well, Joyce was more a disciple of Vico.
So am I.
There we go. And we have another one here, Donald Kunze, who has a big library of Vico texts. I hope he has Isaiah Berlin's book.
Natürlich.
What?
Natürlich. Yes, I do.
Oh, that's that to me is a key text.
I was in the lecture hall when Isaiah Berlin talked about Vico and Herder and all that. But
I'm not.
He's more the spokesman of it rather than the opposite. No, I prefer Joyce's version. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you see, people forget that history was an invention of a late book of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel. This is where the idea of history as a linear projection first was uttered. It was the idea of the prophet Daniel. It's a book written in Aramaic, and Daniel was a man who, in exile, had the idea that the future will not be a mere repetition of the past, but will be otherwise. Are we obliged to follow this folly? I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, Vico certainly would say no. And yet, you are certainly the one who invented in the West the idea that it has a cyclical structure, which is readable.
Right. I think it's time to appreciate that it is a complete fairy tale, and history, insofar as it exists, it's a result of people taking certain steps, thinking certain way, and it's up to us to, as it were, to invent the future. It's not written anywhere, nor is it deterministic. And therefore, this whole Hegelian thing is sheer nonsense, in my view.
Well, of course, if we had any Sunni imams here, they would certainly object to your remarks too, because they seem to think that everything is written and everything is determined.
Well, this is part of this terrible syndrome, you know, this uncritical belief in some text of this kind or that kind. Look at the excitement of reviewing some fragments of supposedly old text of the Old Testament. What sheer nonsense, in the sense that it has no authority. It has nothing to tell us that we don't know yet. And yet people are so, well, Islam is no more than repetition of the Old Testament, just as Christianity is. One is earlier, one is a bit later, and the other one is a further later on the line. But that doesn't make it any better. I mean, Islam saw itself as a...
I'm more old-fashioned than you, because I believe that the Old Testament is a divine act of God's revealing himself to the world.
Oh, you mean you really believe that?
I really believe that.
Well, then everything makes sense. Yes, you're right. Okay.
I think it was an incomplete revelation. Its completion is fulfilled in the New Testament.
And then in the Islam, right?
Oh no. I think
why not? The same story. Have you read the Quran?
I have read it.
You have. So you know the Quran is almost a repetition, different version of what you read in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. Exactly the same stories, just little changes.
You know, I went to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and there a very important moment is when you walk by the sword of the prophet. And I said to my wife, you're looking at the sword of the prophet, but I said, you will never see a museum in which you see the sword of Jesus. Never.
That's true.
And that's because the ideas in Islam, in the Quran, and the ideas in the New Testament are, I think, in many ways in opposition.
I wouldn't dispute that.
But this is already
Jesus, after all, who is historically better known to us than any of the Old Testament characters, was born during a terrible war between the Romans and the Jews. And it's only when he understood that this war was hopeless, he became the Jesus that we know, that's for sure. And I respect him as a historical figure. I respect him enormously for saying no to the Roman and no to the Jews, and suggesting that there is a third way. This I granted to him as historical figure. But all this mumbo jumbo of the Old Testament is abracadabra. You know what abracadabra means in Aramaic? It simply means
but
the wish that you make in your words will become a reality. That's what it means.
But I suspect that when you say that he comes at a moment when the war was hopeless and responds to it, that you're sort of reasserting the idea of a zeitgeist.
Oh no, not at all. Not at all. There was no zeitgeist. He was really extraordinary in being able to resist the temptation of either, collaboration with the Romans, or you see, once he began to lose members of his own family in that war against the Romans, that he changed his mind. That was not zeitgeist, that was creative thinking. What can I do in these narrow circumstances? And that was the genius of Jesus, no doubt. But this is quite apart from the authority of the Old Testament. Indeed, he himself failed to accept the authority of the Old Testament. This is what's so great about him.
Well, this is the most original and daring interpretation of the events that I've heard yet.
Thank you.
But it's certainly true that the idea of a zeitgeist, which comes to us from the left-wing Hegelian historicists, is a very controversial idea. It's not something that's self-evidently true. It's also mysterious how artists seem to have a certain strange antenna for aspects of their age, and they experience these things and express them in ways that have a lot of things in common across very great distances and different languages and cultures. Sometimes it's all concentrated, like in Paris in the beginning of the 20th century, or some other examples we can name. Maybe Poznan in 2021, but other times it's very diffuse, and we only can see it, or we could say imagine it in retrospect.
I think you exaggerate. I tell you an anecdote. When I was teaching in the Royal College of Art in the 80s, 70s, 80s especially, students always ask me, but what are you, Hilda? You're not a Freudian, you're not a Marxist, you're not this, you're not that. What are you? So I looked at them and I said, do I have to be whatever you mentioned? They could not understand it. They could not grasp it, that you have the option not to be any of the above. See, I think that if there is a moment in which some people seem to share something, it's very possible. And there are many, many different groups of people. But you see, Picasso was not a cubist when he painted Cubism. He painted what he painted, and then Apollinaire called it Cubism. And other people made it into a kind of ideology. But Braque and Picasso, country, did they think of Cubism? Certainly not. You see, the most important so-called movements in art were the invention of critics after the event. Only things like futurism was first written up as a manifesto, and luckily Marinetti was married to a woman whose father owned the Figaro. This is how the Marinetti manifesto was published in the front page of Le Figaro. And Figaro then was even more important than it is now. It still exists, right? Well,
I always laugh when I think of the story that in World War I, in 1914, they invented the first camouflage military equipment. And when Picasso and Braque were walking on the Champs-Élysées, there was a military parade, and they saw these, for the first time, these camouflage vehicles, and they looked at each other and said, "We invented that."
It's a good story. Whatever they invented, they had no ideology or movement in mind. They invented it and also refrained from completely to adopt it. Because if you remember, Picasso never really did anything abstract. On the contrary, when it became more abstract, then on the side, he would make a drawing to make sure that he hasn't lost his touch.
So as Mondrian is flowers.
Most people that we associate with such movement, didn't have that movement. And sometimes by mistake. For example, I think that Mondrian relying on Voyager is one of the most saddest stories that I know, because Voyager was fundamentally wrong. The dichotomy between abstraction and empathy is false, evidently. Why? Because every painting has both, like language. Language without grammar doesn't exist, but grammar without language doesn't exist either. So is empathy and abstraction. There is no painting without abstraction. There is no painting without empathy.
I know that.
Otherwise, was a Nazi when he wrote it, and a Nazi later on.
I know that Andy Warhol aspired to be like Moholy-Nagy because he was taught at Pittsburgh when he was studying about Moholy-Nagy made the telephone paintings, where he would call up an assistant on the phone and tell him how to paint the painting. and then it would be considered a Moholy-Nagy work. And so Warhol very often was not present for many of his works, and he always thought, well, it's really the camera that does the work anyway.
Well, maybe this could be a good advice to the students. Speaking of the situation when there is a story or the narrative which follows the appearance of the object. So when it appears and you do not necessarily identify with it, at least you should accept it. You should bless it. What do you think? I very often happen to be really like, as a young artist, well, I felt only better if somebody applied onto things that I did, meanings and topics and the stories that I wouldn't really be even able to recognize. But as long as it was pronounced, I said, yes, well, it means, yeah, well, it looks like, actually, it is what I did. although when making, I had completely no control, no idea that could be perceived, that such thing that I did could have been perceived in that way. So as I think, speaking of the time with the zeitgeist and the New Testament, when you were I was also wondering about Jesus as somebody who, there are so many reliquiums, there are so many objects that seem to be an output of his narrative. He didn't make them. He was just a performer, but we had so many objects that are somehow created as a follow-up from his performance.
Well, the most irreverent art dealers in the world are in Paris, and the slang for any genre painting of a crucifixion that they use, which as a Catholic I'm offended by, they call it an acrobat.
An acrobat?
Yes. L'acrobat.
Okay.
Because they call this a crucifixion, because he's suspended in the air on and they call him like a circus performer. But Parisian art dealers also have a tremendous amount of wine at lunchtime. And that's after they've had at least 3 glasses of calva with their morning coffee. So it used to be, if you just knew Greek mythology and the Bible, you could look at any painting and know what it was about. And that period lasted much later than people like to admit. I mean, all the way into, I would say, all the way into the late 19th century. In Spain, it probably lasted all the way into the late 20th century.
Mm. Mm.
In Poland, it might still be going on.
Well, just speaking of Poland, just a small digression. I happened to work recently with a performer, a very interesting artist who's called Leon Dziemaszkiewicz. We did 2 pieces together with him called Ubu 1 and Ubu 2. Of course, the reference to Ubu le Roi. But what's interesting, what is really interesting for me in terms of his performance is that he's using a very strong references with the Polish symbols and the Polish stories, Polish literature, and what he does, and he performs, of course, with this. And speaking from a Polish perspective, it's all very obvious and literal. And I found the fascination on the faces of the people when he performed all this in Berlin, when the stories were completely unvisible. They were completely undepictable. And from that perspective, I would find his work would be even much more interesting. The narrative was really concealed, really hidden, just because of the knowledge of the audience. So suddenly we're dealing with the kind of new quality, speaking of the formal terms, which happens to be very interesting just because it's the content is completely invisible. I mean, despite Polish people who know this story.
I think there's even an even more intimate idea of that, because sometimes the work of art can reveal secret things about the artist's personal history, which are only known to the artist. Maybe the artist's relationship with a lover or parents or a school teacher or a childhood trauma or something like that.
But do we all need to know this? This is a question, Drew. Do we need to know those stories? Or do they actually block us from getting something more than the artist can expect?
I think if we want to have a successful reading of the work, and if those elements are an integral part of the work, then you won't be able to successfully read the work without knowing those things. But then it becomes a decision for the artists to reveal the narrative or not. I mean, I remember that reading a book by J.G. Ballard, the English writer, and he has a very autobiographical book about his experience in the war in Shanghai in the 1930s. And he saw there was a very sudden surprise bombing of the city by the Japanese Air Force. And he saw a bomb go off in front of a big car that was occupied by a British woman who was a teacher of his and for whom he had some erotic feelings, even as a child. And the bomb picked her up out of the seat of the car and cast her through the glass of the front window entirely. And in this way, he remembered as a child the frisson of seeing when she was cast through the glass and killed that way, the glimpse of her stocking underneath her dress, which became visible because of the explosion. And this, in a way, you could imagine that it explains so much of his later writing, including his book Crash, which is all about the relationship between eroticism and car crashes that are really only peculiar to the mind of J.G. Ballard. But had he not made this book explicit, made this incident explicit in a piece of writing that describes it very in detail and scrupulously, and with all its horror and fascination at the same time, one could never have that way of reading his later novels. So I think sometimes it could be very personal, or it could be part of the national experience.
Any students' questions, please? I can sense the certain l'esprit d'escalier on the horizon. So, Drew, you may expect questions being forwarded to you later on after the talk.
That's good. I hope everyone has a chance to look at some of the supplementary materials, and especially to look at the list of artists' names, and maybe to have at least a quick review of some of their work. Many of them are in Berlin, some are not, but I think certainly they provide a sort of panopticon of much of the great work that's being done today in different parts of the world. And they're invariably artists worth a look. I mean, I assume that we don't take honors and awards so seriously as a criterion for aesthetic evaluation, but I mean, Sadana Fif, for example, he won the Prix Marcel Duchamp. Gregor Schneider's in there. He won the Golden Lion at Venice. And his work is something that very much involves Poland, because if you see the work itself, all you see, which we all saw in Berlin, parked in front of the Volksbühne, was a dump truck filled with rubble. And he set up lights and a little improvised stairway so that you could climb the stairs and gaze into the bed of the dump truck and see this rubble, which was the rubble from a building that had been torn down. And that was the metonymic embodiment of the work of art. And the narrative is something very easy to understand. Everyone knows about his work, the Haus UR, which was his original family house in Mönchengladbach, which he altered to make his work of art. But about 250 meters away, there was a house that was almost identical, the same kind of sort of bourgeois house of the area that was very typical and probably built around the 1890s or the first years of the 20th century, with a facade that had these slightly touches and flourishes that presented a mild allusion to the Baroque. But he discovered that for some reason, on the same day every year, someone put flowers in front of that house 250 meters away. And it took him about 25 years to understand that the day they put the flowers was very significant, because this was the birthday of Joseph Goebbels. And apparently in that part of North Rhine-Westphalia, there were still some remnants of people who considered him a person worthy of veneration. He was ashamed of this. And his reaction to it was he bought the house right away. And then he said, how can I make this a work of art without making it into a shrine, which is the opposite of what I want to achieve? And it was a terrible problem for him, not to sanctify this work in some way by elevating it to an aesthetic status. And so what he did was he learned very quickly that the bureaucracy of the town was such that they refused to allow him to destroy the facade, but they allowed him to destroy the inner part of the building, which he did immediately. He reduced it to rubble so that there was probably no fragment of it bigger than a can of beer. And then he loaded all those pieces into a dump truck. And after they were to be observed at the Volksbühne, where no one could recognize them as a work of art, which is characteristic of most metonymic narrative, he drove the truck to a site in Poland which had been the site of an atrocity. And there he got the cooperation of the people in the town to excavate the site of the atrocity where people had been murdered in the war. And he filled it with, that excavation with the rubble from the truck, and it was all covered over with dirt again. And that was the end of the story. Beyond that, there is no exhibition, and there is no conventional documentation, and no adequate historicization. So this is another example of metonymic narrative and how the question of medium is wide open. He took me inside the house before it was destroyed. And he said, you're here in the area. Instead of staying in a hotel and spending the money for a hotel, I can offer you to sleep in this house. And I refused, even though I did not know at that point whom the house had belonged to. I didn't know. But there was something about it that I found so chilling that it was out of the question that I could accept to sleep there.
Wow.
So the boundaries of metonymic narrative are sometimes really unexpected and inclusive of all sorts of things we might never suspect. You know, Picasso made Guernica after a Basque village that was bombed. And I visited the village, Guernica, many times because I lived for a while in the Basque country and it was easy to access it. But even 60 years after the bombing, after the event, relatives of the murdered people of the town would still wander the hillsides digging up the hillsides, looking for the remains of their relatives who had been killed in the bombing and which had never been recovered or never identified. 60 years later. I think they still do it because the Basques are really stubborn people. But of course, the painting, we can always tell what it is by looking at it. And you don't have to have as much training as Ulrich in Bochum to look at the painting and to have a very good idea of its meaning and what it depicts. So I do not mean to suggest that Guernica is a sort of a forerunner of metonymic narrative. What perhaps is a forerunner is John Knight. John Knight has a work, you walk into an exhibition space, which is a conventional gallery, and you see about 8 or 9 big, elaborate, expensive bouquets of flowers. Each one in a vase that's on the floor of the gallery. And when you know the narrative, you know that these are bouquets from the 9 restaurants that were frequented by all the biggest owners of the biggest galleries in New York as places to woo collectors and do business. So to take these flowers out, which were changed every day by the restaurants, and assemble them in an exhibition space was a sort of act of institutional critique. And it's also, I would argue, a forerunner of metonymic narrative, already done in the early 70s. Buchloh always calls him the other JK to dissociate him from an artist for whom he has contempt, which is Jeff Koons. But of course, there's another one, which is Joseph Kosuth. So there are 3 JKs. So I'm very grateful that you don't think I'm crazy. And that you were this responsive to this rather unorthodox point of view. I'm also lucky that the artists were hospitable to the idea. A couple of times I was very relieved when they said, yes, that's exactly it. Which I never expect, but I'm always very grateful when it happens.
Like now we're very grateful, Drew, for what just happened.
Thank you. And I'm grateful to you. I hope I'll get to at least listen to more lectures.
Well, yes, we're hoping that this from my point of view, this is a wonderful thing which is happening now, and also something which I've not intentionally expected, but I think the company is really the company that we could just follow. I just have this feeling that those lectures, they should have been provided with unlimited time for a discussion, but the only thing is that we can get all exhausted physically, not intellectually, because it's a feast every time. So thank you so much, Drew.
I hope the next time can be
participation. So I hope
very much
the next 2 weeks.
see you even on screen.
Yes. Then next one will be Warren Neidich.
Great, he's a friend of mine, and also he's done a lot of metonymic narrative work.
So that'll be a good way to continue with what you started.
But the main metonymic narrative work of his you'll probably see, which is a neon work about the so-called Pizzagate. Pizzagate is about a story that was continued with the so-called QAnon conspiracy theory. It's the idea that there's a cabal of evil leftist Democrats in the American political scene who are all child molesters and also murderers of children, and that they would congregate in a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yes.
And this conspiracy theory was disseminated gradually through the QAnon conspiracy on the internet, which was an inspirer of the January 6th riots at the U.S. Capitol of Trump supporters. It's also closely linked to Trump supporters in the United States. And this neon, you would never guess at first that narrative by looking at it, but it's a Warren Neidich work. And as far as I know, he's the only artist who has brought attention to this. And he did it long before QAnon became a household word in the United States.
So this sounds like an introduction for another lecture, Drew. That's great.
Well, I mustn't keep you then. And I'm grateful that you spent this much time. And I'm also very grateful to Pavel for helping me to set it up.
It was a pleasure, Drew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Wonderful. See you next 2 weeks, I hope.
I hope so too.
Yes. Stay well. Bye. Bye. Thank you.